O Lord, transform us this morning by your word and in sacrament. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I invite you to be seated this morning. Master, says Simon Peter, we've worked all night and we've caught nothing. Yet if you say, I'll let down the nets. As Luke tells us, it's early morning on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and Simon Peter and his fellow fishermen are frustrated, and they're empty. Literally, their nets are empty, and they've put in a whole night's work to no avail. But then Jesus shows up. Set out into the depths. Cast your nets into the sea. Jesus, we've been doing just that. We've come up empty. But somehow Peter knows to trust, and so he obeys. If you say so, we'll do that. And they do as they do, and as they do, the nets go from purposeless cord to full of fish. And Peter's own emptiness turns into the fullness of Epiphany, the revelation of God. When God calls Isaiah, his is a movement of emptiness and failure to epiphany as well. Woe is me, he says, I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. Who am I to be called by God? I'm not exactly anyone's number one choice. And yet, in the transforming and the transfixing presence of God, he declares, here am I, send me, Lord. In his letter to the church in Corinth, St. Paul too feels unworthy of the call of God. I am the least of the apostles, he admits, persecuting the church as I did. But by God's grace, I'm here. By God's grace, Paul's emptiness turns to epiphany as well. Paul later on laments, I'm the worst of sinners. And only the patient presence of God allowed him to move beyond the inertia, beyond the lethargy caused by his painful memories and his regrets from the past. After witnessing the miraculous catch of fish, Peter has much the same reaction. Go away from me, Lord. Get away. I'm a sinful man. Jesus' answer to Peter is his answer to Isaiah, to Paul, and to each of us in our fears of inadequacy or our anxieties around failure and not being good enough. This may be you this morning, bound by fear, bound by anxiety of failure or inadequacy. And what Jesus says to Peter, he says to all of us. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. What these three characters teach us is that human sin, failure, inadequacy were not obstacles to God's call. God's message never requires a perfect messenger. Because of this, embracing rather than denying our fallenness is a path of freedom. It's a path of liberty, not a path of shame. It's an act of honest self-awareness, not pessimistic self-hatred. You see, recognizing our own brokenness is not about being hard on ourselves or being hard on others. It's about being honest with one another and honest with God. That we all know failure. We all, deep down, know something of the anxiety and the insecurity of not being good enough. Woe is me. We all know something of the brokenness and failure of our humanity. And Jesus says no to all of it. It's not about self-justification. It's about the acceptance of God's love that overwhelms that inadequacy. God accepting us, who we are as we are, transforming us by His grace into the fullness of our humanity. This is God turning the empty of life into the epiphany of His glory. And the good news, God is calling you this morning. You in the midst of your insecurities, you in the midst of your failures and the brokenness you've experienced or are experiencing in your life and the lives around you, God is calling you to the same work that He called Isaiah, to the same thing He called St. Paul, Peter. God's love is drawing you, calling you, inviting you to be a part of this community of the called, this community church, called out for the sake of staring down the brokenness of our humanity all around us. Whether it's in poverty or in systemic injustice, in the spiral of addictions, in the mess of broken relationships, in the scarcity of resources for the marginalized, God is calling you to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ all around you. Simply by being a beacon of love and mercy. Not as a perfect person, not as a morally sound specimen, but you, as you are this morning, to come and fish for people, to catch people up in the net of God's overwhelming abundance of love and grace, to come to His table this morning, not as some reward for good behavior, but to taste and see that the Lord is good and that our trust is well placed in Him. God once called a man named George Herbert, that great English poet, and He called him out of a life of riches and comfort and wealth to a life of complete renunciation, where Herbert gave up all of his wealth to be a simple pastor. And he always felt inadequate to the task. Yet by the grace of God, he lived into his calling. He died 4 years into his parish work as a young man. But he left us some of the most beautiful verse in the English language, where he wrestled with his inadequacy and with the overwhelming love of God. This is from his sonnet, Affliction 4. Broken in pieces all asunder, Lord, hunt me not, a thing forgot. Once a poor creature, now a wonder tortured in the space betwixt this world and that of grace. Herbert knew that the church isn't a community of perfection. It's not a community of perfect people by any stretch. We live betwixt. We live betwixt, as Herbert says, as creatures of wonder, betwixt us and our feelings of inadequacy and God's gracious calling, right in the middle of that. So the church is not perfect. We are a community that limps along together in the world, witnessing to the miracle of God's transformative love, God's transfixing love in the midst of brokenness. As together we wade out into the deeps of this world, trusting that if we cast out His net of love and mercy and grace, we will all be caught up in something incredible, something astounding and amazing. We will behold the glory of God all around us. And we will have way more than we can handle. Thanks be to God. Amen.